Bienvenidos a todos y es una gran satisfacción que podamos tener con nosotros aquí al profesor Julio Crespo MacLennan. Quiero dar la bienvenida también a los profesores de los másteres que nos acompañan, a la mesa, la senadora Alexandra Dumitrescu, el director del máster en Internacionales de los Negocios, el profesor Julio Maillo. Como sabéis, estamos clausurando lo que es la edición número 20 del máster en Relaciones Internacionales, lo cual da pues, una clara visibilidad de la continuidad y, como se sabe, además de la excelente evaluación en los rankings del que gozan los másteres, en particular este, y el máster 13 de la Unión Europea, 13ª edición, 13ª edición, que además este año hemos empezado la edición online, que está teniendo también pues mucha acogida. Además, el máster en Derecho Internacional de los Negocios, que se cursa junto con el máster habilitante. Y vamos a dar entrada, el curso que viene, a un nuevo máster que es en Geopolítica, Seguridad y Defensa, que pues para nuestra satisfacción también está teniendo una muy buena acogida. Bueno, voy a presentar muy brevemente al profesor Julio Crespo MacLennan, historiador, analista de Relaciones Internacionales, escritor, ensayista. Como ya dice su apellido, Crespo MacLennan, es español y británico. Y además, como veréis todos enseguida, absolutamente british y absolutamente español, cosa nada fácil de conseguir. Julio Crespo, que ha colaborado con nosotros a lo largo de los años y que tengo el orgullo, la satisfacción de contar como un viejo amigo, hizo su doctorado en filosofía en St. Anthony's College en Oxford, que ha sido durante mucho tiempo pues, un verdadero centro de los estudios sobre España y América Latina, pero en particular España, donde fue Fellow en Iberian and European Studies. Ha sido también profesor visitante en la Cátedra Príncipe de Asturias en Tufts, en Boston, y en la London School of Economics. Actualmente es profesor asociado en la Escuela de Estudios Globales, Estudios Públicos, en IE University, y es también director del Observatorio Hispánico, un think tank con base en Oxford. El profesor Julio Crespo se especializó primero en Historia Contemporánea de España, como miembro de la escuela que fundó precisamente Sir Raymond Carr en Oxford, y después focalizó sus investigaciones en Historia Moderna de Europa, en particular la historia comparada, historia imperial comparada, y el legado de Europa en el mundo. También ha trabajado en el ámbito de la diplomacia cultural como director del Instituto Cervantes en Estambul, en Dublín y en London, luego 3 sitios de lo más atractivos, empezando por Estambul, y ha sido vicepresidente de UNIC, European Union National Institutes for Culture. Contribuye habitualmente en la prensa diaria, particularmente en ABC, también en revistas académicas como Política Exterior, Revista Occidente, y es autor de varios libros, sobre todo sobre historia de España, historia europea. Su libro más reciente se titula precisamente Europa, cómo Europa conformó el mundo moderno, formó el mundo moderno, publicado por Pegasus Books en 2019, libro que ha recibido muy buena crítica y además ha sido publicado recientemente en China. Esperemos que los chinos se enteren de Europa gracias al libro del profesor Julio Crespo. El profesor Julio Crespo va a dictar una conferencia, aproximadamente 40 minutos, en fin, el tiempo que teníamos asignado. Después también algunos minutos para si hay interés en plantear alguna pregunta. Y el título de la conferencia, An Aspiring Global Power in a Post-Western World, The Challenges of the EU in the 21st Century. No sabéis nada, les dejo.
Dear professors, dear students, let me begin by thanking Professor Benito for this very generous introduction and, of course, for this kind invitation. It's great to be here in this prestigious university in which I had the pleasure of working some years ago and of which I have fond memories. So this is a happy event. The end of the year is always a very special moment for both academics and students. It's a time when we usually look forward to a pleasant summer with a very rewarding sense of achievement. And I will try and, in tune with this atmosphere, try and keep my high spirits, despite the fact that the analysis of the challenges ahead for the European Union are pretty daunting at some stages. So what I'm going to do, just as we always do at this time of the year, is with our personal lives, is probably take a step back and try and make a balance of what we've achieved and get ready for the challenges ahead by making an overview of the EU in the world. And I will be providing a few snapshots of where it stands and the threats and opportunities ahead, as it is an overwhelming ordeal that we have ahead. So, first of all, the EU as a global power, or rather what seems even more, a superpower. I say a superpower because it's been very encouraging for those of us who believe in Europe to hear this word in reference to the European Union, superpower. We even heard the EU, the President of the European Commission referred to an agenda for the EU as a superpower, and this is very encouraging if we consider that not long ago, 10, 15 years ago, we were actually debating the threats to unity and the dangers of dismemberment. So this is quite a new frame of mind, and it is indeed very encouraging. Superpower, of course, is a very strong word. When we talk of superpowers in international relations, there's only been really only two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. And we soon learned that only one of them was genuinely a superpower. So it is difficult to believe in the EU as a superpower. I would rather refer to as a global power, which is already a lot. Superpower implies a hegemonic power in the world, which seems excessive, but certainly to see the EU as a global power, sharing power with two or three other world powers in the 21st century is already quite an achievement. So let me briefly examine the elements of the EU as a global power. In terms of the elements of power, well, it is the second largest economy in the world, or the third largest in purchasing power parity after the US and China. The euro is the second most traded currency after the dollar. These are important elements of great power status. Apart from that, of course, we have to take into account many other elements that might not be how we traditionally measure great power status, but that are very important when we think of the extraordinary power of the European Union. All European Union countries rank very highly among the top 50 in Human Development Index. This is very important. And of course, this is in connection to what we were just talking about, the attraction of Spain as an academic center. Well, it has a lot to do with this. There is a European dream, which explains why Europe attracts people from all over the world. It is the largest international donor, this is very important, which of course explains why it can have great influence in the global south and the developing world. It shapes international relations and influences the present world order by the so-called Brussels effect. This is a series of regulations that influences international business development, elevating standards worldwide, shape policy in areas such as data privacy, consumer health, environmental protection, antitrust, online hate speech. All these are important elements of soft power. And we might even say that this is a postmodern way of wielding global power as a superpower. And this is a very important element of exerting influence in the 21st century. In an era of multipolar disorder, and this is how we can describe the present situation in the world, the EU is better placed than all others to impose order, at least from the legal perspective. Of course, imposing order is a very big word, and we will see later how this is not easy from the point of view of real politics. But this is already quite an achievement. Of course, the role of the EU is very much influenced by the legacy of Europe in the world. And this is another advantage that the EU has in the 21st century. More than 2/3 of the 193 nations represented in the EU, in the UN, have been part of European empires or have had some connection with them at some time of their history. So this gives a tremendous projection to Europe. And this is, of course, in connection to 5 centuries of hegemony. We live in a global civilization. Increasingly, this is one of the conclusions of this 21st century. There is a global civilization in the making, and we can say that that Europe provided the essential elements of this global civilization. Elements like the market economy and free trade, democracy, rule of law, press freedom, human rights, all this have been provided by Europe. And this is a very powerful tool, and it explains its relevance and influence, despite the fact that it's not widely perceived as a global power, let alone a superpower. This is very interesting when we see international opinion polls asking how people perceive great powers and what countries would they identify as great powers. Well, they always think of the same: the US, China. They even think of other European countries that were great powers at some stage, but they struggle to identify the EU as a great power. So this explains why the EU is a silent great power. Silence in itself is not bad as long as the elements that make it shape the world and defend European interests are there, and the EU is capable of making it prevail. And of course, this is increasingly difficult in a post-European and post-Western world. We have to clearly define this. What is a post-European and a post-Western world? Well, basically, when we use this term, we mean a world order in which the West no longer has the capacity to occupy the whole world order and decide without depending on other powers. So how and when did this happen? How has Europe coped with this reality? Ernest Hemingway's novel, The Sun Also Rises, has one of the main characters that is asked at one stage, why did he go bankrupt? And he answers in two ways. First gradually, and then suddenly. Well, this, the reason why I mentioned this fictional character is because, well, fiction is very useful to understand reality. And I mentioned this because when I was in your situation as a student finishing the academic year, this was the time of the year when I always gave up reading non-fiction and I switched to fiction. And I remember reading this novel that did have a big impact on me. This is something I strongly recommend because fiction will help you a lot later understand the realities of life. And well, in the same way that we have this character of Ernest Hemingway's Sun Also Rises, this reminds me of how Europeans have collectively become aware of their decline, first gradually and then suddenly. Let me ponder on this process that is both gradual and sudden. If I can give you a quick summary of the rise and fall of Europe in the world, there is a slow but steady rise beginning in 1492 with the era of geographic discoveries. Then in the 18th century, between the 18th and 19th century, we see how this rise becomes a meteoric rise propelled by the scientific and industrial revolution. This is when the so-called Great Divergence between the West and the rest takes place. And then, of course, there's a critical moment when, in the year 1900, the United States becomes the largest economy in the world. So from then, Europe is lagging behind the US. And this, of course, gives way to reflections on the future of Europe. This is a time when Oswald Spengler wrote The Decline of the Western Civilization. This is a time when Paul Valéry warned that civilization can die. This was in the gloomy atmosphere of the end of this First World War. And where does this trend of decline reach the lowest point? This is 1945. We can say this is the sudden moment, equivalent to Hemingway's character of feeling that bankruptcy has reached. Well, this is in the, when we think of European collective mentality, this is the wake-up call, 1945. And of course, European integration is the reaction to this lowest point in European history, to overcome the twin evils of nationalism and war that could allow to correct this trend of decline and retain relevance in the world. And the EU has allowed Europe to weather the storm of decline and retain global relevance. This is as far as Europe is concerned, but then we have the other trend, which is the Western decline. So when does the Western, the end of the Western era begin? Well, this we can argue that the late 90s already we see this coming with the rise of China and the BRICS. 9/11 is a critical year. And of course, if you want a sudden moment when this is clearly perceptive is in the year 2008, when we have the first, the Washington summit of the G20. This is the moment when clearly we can say that we are in a new era. We see there for the first time a post-Western world in which the BRICS are already sharing power, increasingly sharing power and influencing the Western powers. So this is a new frame of mind, and this, of course, requires a totally new mentality. Now, how does Europe cope with this reality, and how has Europe managed? Well, reinventing itself and reinventing new structures, new political structures. Europe invented the nation state in the 17th century. And it invented something new in the 20th century, which is what we see in the EU. And of course, what is this exactly? It's not a supranational state or a federal state. This idea collapsed with the European Constitution. We could say that it's more along the lines of a supranational network of nations. And this very innovative idea has allowed the EU to develop the mechanisms to represent 27 countries in the world. And of course, the reason why so many countries in Europe gave up power voluntarily for this collective experiment is because they believe that this solved many of their internal problems and would strengthen them collectively. If Spain is the problem, Europe is the solution, was stated by the philosopher Ortega y Gasset. And of course, this is not only a European phenomenon, it's a Spanish phenomenon. This is a phenomenon that many countries in Europe experience internally, which explains why they turn to the European Union for a solution. And the European Union law has allowed the rule of law to prevail within all its members. This is very important, even when some of them decide to defy it, as is the case of Spain at present. So the EU is synonymous with economic and political power at this stage, and this is very important. If it disappeared, it would have to be invented shortly after. And this is the reason why Brexit has not given way to other countries exiting the EU, which is something very interesting, and this is something that Eurosceptics were not expecting a few years ago. So why is it that despite of all problems, despite all internal strifes, the EU is not dismembered? Well, it's very simple. Individually, European nations are aware that they may be able to survive, but certainly not thrive in the 21st century individually. And there is a great difference between surviving and thriving. And this is because the 21st century is a century in which great powers are giants. The US is a giant, China is a giant, India is a giant, even Russia retains certain elements of a gigantic power. And this is why Europe has managed to stand up to all these other powers by retaining the elements of a giant. So how can it rise to the challenge of remaining influential or even survive in the post-Western world? Let me now turn to the challenges of the 21st century. First challenge I'd like to mention is the military and defense challenge. We live in an increasingly Hobbesian world in which the Kantian dream of peace is under threat, and we have to face the reality that there is war in Europe. War in Ukraine is the most serious war in Europe since the end of the Second World War. And of course, this not only has reawakened some of the ghosts of the past associated to war, but it also is a wake-up call in the sense that if Russia wins this war, the principles on which the EU has been built and its security will be seriously undermined. This is a very big problem because the European dream that I mentioned before was financed thanks to low defense budgets. The welfare state of which European states are so proud was possible thanks to the fact that for many years defense budgets were low. And they were low because we had a big brother, the United States, with the largest army in the world, willing to defend Europe. This, of course, is now changing. And it is in this context that we have the debate on the need for a European army and the strategic autonomy, which requires a change of mentality and a financial commitment that could only be afforded by reforming the welfare state. Now, all of those who know European Union well and know the European mentality well know how difficult this is. And we have to ask ourselves whether this is realistic. Since it may not be realistic, perhaps another alternative would be to combine this with the idea that NATO should continue playing an important role and renew the idea of the two pillars of NATO that was actually proposed many years ago by Kennedy. The idea that NATO European countries should focus on their own defense. And this, of course, we're going to see Europe and the EU evolving along these lines. And this, of course, implies also working with other European nations like Norway and the United Kingdom. This is something that requires to be addressed because, as I said before, Europe needs to, Europe that has managed to retain hegemony, very much playing on the elements of soft power, has to bear in mind the elements of hard power very especially. Paraphrasing Franklin Roosevelt, we can say that Europe from now on will have to speak softly but carry a big stick. And of course, this is very important because Russia is threatening what the EU has achieved and it must be able to respond. Let me now turn to the economic and technological challenge. And here we face the fact that despite the figures I gave you initially, the economy of the European Union is not up to the challenge of its stature as a global power in the long run. First problem is indebtedness. The debt in the EU has spiraled. Countries like Spain have experienced an increase from 40% to about 110% of GDP, of EU to GDP, debt to GDP. This, of course, is, we can take consolation that this is not so dramatic if we consider that the other great powers are also facing this problem of indebtedness. The US has 111%. Even China, that was a country that boasted on the fact that it had no debt, suddenly has a very big debt problem. But of course, the problem with Europe is that one thing is the debt, the other thing is making it sustainable. And in this aspect, America and China are in a much stronger position. We can say that we're reaching here the point of imperial overstretch, when powers reach a moment when their liabilities are much greater than the assets, and this eventually makes them collapse. And this is a very dangerous moment. So this takes us to the issue of productivity and innovation. Growing dependence on energy and technology. There can be no great power without economic, technical, and energy sovereignty. And this is a great challenge that Europe has ahead over the next years. While the US leads the digital revolution, China has managed to become a leading competitor, but Europe is lagging behind. Investment in research and technology and artificial intelligence is 5 to 50 times higher in the US and China than in Europe. These figures are extremely worrying. And in scientific research output, the world's top 10 universities include 6 in China. This should be a wake-up call for European universities that are increasingly limited to teach rather than research. So what can we do about this? Of course, this requires, we have political leaders giving all sorts of indications: deregulation of industry, free capital markets, instill entrepreneurship among the population, incentivize people to take risks and innovate rather than live on public money and state subsidies. So this requires Europeans in the 21st century to be able to invent, innovate, and produce. Of course, this is not something that Europe is not impossible, is not incapable of doing. Do not underestimate European talent. Europe was still shaping the world in times of decline during the American century. Most of the ideas were still conceived by Europeans and in Europe. I can give you the examples of Einstein in physics, Keynes in economics, Picasso, Joyce, and Le Corbusier in modernism. These are Europeans setting trends not that long ago. So Europe has been a hub of ideas for a very long time, and it will need to recover this spirit. But of course, this requires also a combination of work ethics and inquisitive spirit that our ancestors had, and which allowed the scientific and industrial revolution and gave Europe a technological hegemony. We're talking, in other words, about a new mentality, and this implies replacing the predominant hedonism or complacency by a certain Spartan spirit mixed with audacity that made European hegemony possible. Let me now turn to other challenges very quickly. Demography and migration. Demography is a very important element in international relations that is very often overlooked or neglected. And of course, the EU faces a formidable demographic challenge, as the EU population is stagnating in several countries. It's opened its borders to migrant population based on the assumption that Europe needs labor force and that they will incorporate to its culture. But this is not happening. A large percentage is not adapting the European culture and values, but rather the opposite. Multiculturalism has failed, and we can see the rise of radical Islam threatening European culture in some of the great cities, Paris, London, Berlin, Amsterdam. This is leading to an increasing rebellion among Europeans, and this explains the rise of the extreme right, as traditional parties are not responding. A movement advocating Europe for Europeans is spreading across Europe at present. Of course, closing its borders, it's neither realistic nor desirable. Europe needs to attract talent, and for this reason it needs to regulate migration flows in a more efficient way. It needs to have the capacity to welcome migration, but at the same time it needs to go back to the elements of dealing with this demographic crisis that it's facing, which of course would mean protecting and incentivizing families as a pillar of society, promote birth, and protect human life. Identity and belief. This is the other challenge that I would like to mention now. All great powers strongly believed in themselves and their cultural values. But this is not happening in Europe. Unlike the Chinese and the Indians, and to a certain extent the Americans, the Europeans have ceased to believe in themselves. And this, of course, is a very serious problem from the point of view of self-esteem, we can say that European culture is seriously wounded. The West is a wounded civilization in the sense that its members are no longer proud of their ancestors, nor do they live by their values or wish to transmit them to future generations. Ortega Gasset said that a civilization is under threat when the citizens are more eager to extract its benefits than to contribute to it. And we can see that there are elements of this in the present Western civilization, and particularly in Europe. So we see here the problems, and this requires a new European narrative. One that explains the great contribution made by the Western civilization to the world and examine critically the past of Europe and try and project a more positive image of itself. Let me now move towards the end by very quickly mentioning a global agenda for the 21st century that will allow the EU to prevail and be able to maintain this status as a global power. First of all, a new paradigm. We need a new paradigm that will give Europe a role in the world under the technological and digital revolution. Second thing, Europe needs to be able to defend its borders, and therefore it needs to rise to the challenge of the military, what it means militarily to be able to respond in the 21st century. Leadership in the climate diplomacy. This is another role for Europe. Global warming is a very serious threat, and it is in this sphere where Europe has another role. It is better placed than the US and China to promote a green transition. It must also lead in the development of North Africa and Eurasia. The new European partnership and investment plan for Africa and the developing world must be developed, because this is very important to bear in mind. The future of the EU is being decided both within the borders and beyond the borders of Europe. And Europe cannot survive if it's surrounded by poverty and instability. That's why this point is so important. Fifth and final point, the EU needs a new narrative that motivates Europeans and gives them a reason to remain unified and confront the challenges and opportunities of the 21st century. There was a peace narrative that kept the European Union unified and motivated. Now this peace narrative makes sense again. Together with this peace narrative, I would add the narrative of the rule of law, something essential, something that gives the EU cohesion, and something that is increasingly challenged when we see that there is a trend of declining global democracy, threatened by populism and rising authoritarianism. And of course, the third pillar of this is the need for a global role that Europe needs. So to conclude, we can say that we have before us an ordeal of the most grievous kind. This is not my reflection. This was actually Winston Churchill's quote stated in the year 1940, the most difficult moment in British history before, perhaps. So in the light of this, we must take into account that not long ago Europe managed to rise from the ashes in 1945, when it reached the lowest point in civilization. So compared to that moment, Europe has phenomenal assets at present to confront the challenges of the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, profesor Crespo MacLennan, por esta excelente conferencia. Verdaderamente has dado un giro completo, 360 grados, desde el momento de superpower hasta por qué y hasta qué punto Europa ha dejado de, los europeos han dejado de creer en sí mismos, en su cultura, en su civilización, y a la vez la absoluta necesidad de que Europa responda a esos desafíos externos.